Okay friends, it's time to get started on replacing our serpentine belt tensioner assembly. What you're going to notice on this tensioner assembly is you have several coolant ports that come through this. So with that said, we're going to have to drain some coolant. To get started on the job, the first thing that we want to do is make sure that our radiator is nice and cool to the touch. We didn't just come back from a nice road test and it's not hot. After that, go ahead and press this down, turn it counterclockwise to unlock it, and lift it up and away from your face. Give it a quick inspection, set it aside. Now that the radiator cap's off of there, let's make our way underneath the front of the vehicle. We're going to go ahead and remove this plastic shield. Looking at the plastic shield, you're going to find a whole bunch of plastic push clips. To remove these clips, all you have to do is use a trim tool or even just use some cutters and carefully grab onto the center without actually breaking the plastic, and then just pull that down. Once it's unlocked, it should slide right out. There's going to be several that come along inside this area, and you're also going to notice that you have two inside of each of the wheel wells along this area, and then another one right here. Remove your shield. Now that we have that out of the way, we have a nice clear view of the bottom of the radiator. Over on the driver's side, you're going to find the petcock, which is considered the drain for the radiator. Now when I remove this, coolant's going to come out of it. I want to make sure I don't have anything underneath it that might get in the way and divert that coolant so it makes a mess. What we need to happen is this needs to be out of the way. We're going to try to divert this coolant directly into a receptacle so we can recycle it properly. Now with that said, you're going to try to find the mounting points for this wiring harness. There's one located right here. So I'm just going to use a pick. You can use a small screwdriver or whatever you might happen to have. Carefully get in between this area up along here and break it free. Once that's open, you can grab onto that wiring harness. We'll give it a little tug and just try to pull it aside so it's free and clear of this area. Now what you can see that I did here is I used a small piece of cardboard, and I just essentially made a little funneling area to divert everything away from this area so it doesn't make a mess everywhere. Now we can go ahead and open this up, keeping in mind that coolant will come out of it. You need to have hand and eye protection at all times and a collection receptacle under this area. Let's go ahead and carefully grab onto this. We're going to turn it counterclockwise and we should start seeing some coolant come out. Now at this point, you can tell that I've drained out the majority of the coolant. It still has a little bit of a drip, but I'm not necessarily so worried about that. Let's just go ahead and close this off and we'll snug it up. Let's get our wiring resituated. Lock it in so it's secure. Underneath this passenger side rear seat is where the battery is. So I'm going to come right over here, grab onto this seat, and I'm going to carefully lift it up. Once it's pop free, you can remove it. The next thing that we need to do is make our way over to the negative battery terminal. Let's use an 8mm to relieve this from the battery and set it aside. Let's make our way over to the passenger side of the engine. We're going to pay attention to where the serpentine belt is. Before we go ahead and start taking this off, let's pay attention to the routing. You want to make sure you know exactly which pulley it goes over and under. Let's make our way over to this area right here. I'm going to use my serpentine belt tool. We'll come right on here. You can also use a wrench if you had to. We're just going to go ahead and turn this counterclockwise. That's going to relieve the tension from the belt. Now we can carefully slide it off of the alternator up here. We'll get our tool out of the way, and we can carefully remove the belt. Once you have it out of the area, you want to give it a quick inspection. This area here is the ribbed area. You want to make sure you don't see a whole bunch of dry rot cracks on it. Aside from that, if you were to turn it over, you have the backing. For this, you want to make sure it doesn't look like it's damaged or extremely shiny. A little bit shiny is okay, but if it's extremely shiny, more than likely you're going to have some sort of a squeal. Overall, this belt looks reusable. I'm going to set it aside. The next thing we're going to do is make our way right over here to remove the oil fill. Go ahead and turn that counterclockwise, give it a quick inspection, set it aside. Grab onto this engine cover, lift it straight up, and then pull it towards the front of the vehicle to remove it. With that out of the way, we can move along to this area right here. This is a positive battery wire, so you need to make sure that you definitely disconnected the negative battery terminal before you get to this point. Once that's out of the way, you can use a 10mm to remove this nut, and then we'll remove the wire so we can give it an inspection. Pop that wire off of there. Pretty much any time that you disconnect any sort of electrical connector, just give it a quick inspection. Make sure you don't see any funny colors. If you do, it's probably corrosion and it needs to be dealt with. I'm just going to put this nut right back here on the alternator. Now we can move up to the other wire. This one's going to have a little tab right along the back side that I'm going to grab onto with my finger, give it a little tug, and then we'll slide this up and off. We'll give it that inspection like I mentioned. Assuming it looks good, set it aside. Now let's move along to starting to remove this bracket that comes right along the back side of the alternator. Up along the top right here, you're going to find a 15mm headed nut. Go ahead and remove that nut. Follow that down to where it connects onto the engine. We'll use a 10mm for this one. Grab onto that bracket, lift it up and out of the way. Let's continue dismounting the alternator. Looking along the back side of it, you're going to find a 15mm right here, and then another 15mm headed bolt right there. We'll remove the pair of these, and then we'll continue on to the third. Keep note of where that bolt was. Let's remove this one as well. The third bolt is going to be located right here. Almost out. Remove your alternator. With that out of the way, let's continue on to this area back here. You're going to find two coolant hoses that lead down to this area of the bracket. I want to mark one of these hoses so I know where it's going to go back to onto the new assembly. Let's take my little crayon. You can take whatever you have, even a piece of tape, and just put something that's clearly marked on there so you personally know exactly where it's going to go back into place. After that, we're going to continue on with a 10mm. We're going to go ahead and remove this bolt and then remove this unit from the bracket assembly. Inspect your bolts as you remove them. Set them aside. Let's continue on with a pry bar or a long screwdriver. We're going to try to get in between this area and gently try to separate the two. Give this a quick inspection, set it aside, and then do the same exact thing to this hose. This on that bolt back there. This one's going to take a little bit longer to get out of here. Now it's going to be time to get ready to remove the original tensioner assembly. Now there's going to be 3 mounting bolts for this that we're going to have to remove. We have one located right here, one located pretty much directly below it, maybe a little bit diagonally, and then all the way towards the back, you're going to have a third one. So I wanted to mention those three where you can see them very clearly. Aside from that, there are going to be some 90-degree angle tubes that you're going to need to go ahead and remove. There's one that goes into the bottom area right here. This one's going to go into the intake. You can see it down along this area. And then there'll be another one for this area right here that goes down into the engine, right underneath that tensioner. To start removing these bolts, we're going to use a 15mm headed socket with a short extension. I'm just going to loosen this one up, and then I'll fully remove the other two, and then we can finally remove this one in the end. With all of our mounting bolts out of there, you'll notice that you can grab onto this and wiggle it around a little bit. To finish removing this, you remember I talked about the elbows, we need to grab this entire bracket and slide it towards the passenger side. We're going to be pulling both of those elbows out of the areas that they go into the engine. Just going to carefully get in between here with a small pry bar or even a screwdriver. Just gently start prying. I can feel this one starting to come out right here as I'm doing this. So now I'm going to make my way towards the rear so I can try getting that one out at the same time. There it is, friends. With that tensioner out of there, let's continue on by cleaning out the ports that those tubes went into. Looking at this one, you can see that it looks like there's some sort of gasket maker on here. We're going to go ahead and make sure that we remove all that from the outer aspect and try to get inside the hole to make sure it's clean and free of any debris. Now that I have it scraped down, I'll just go ahead and give it a quick wipe down. Take a peek inside. If it still looks like there's any sort of debris, just take some fine sandpaper and go ahead and put it inside there and just clean it up. Give it a good inspection and then do the exact same thing to the other hole. Now it's time to start preparing our brand new tensioner assembly. If you were to look at the original one, you remember that we had those elbows that went into it and then into the engine. So what we need to do is go ahead and turn over our new one, and we're going to go ahead and match it up. The elbows that came with the new, you can tell that they're both different. One's a little bit longer and even a little bit skinnier on one of the ends here. So let's just pay attention to that as we match it up with the original. We have the one that's a little bit longer and it has the two ends that are pretty much the same. That's essentially going to go right here. And then we have the one that's much shorter and it has the bigger end that goes right here, and that one's going to go along the bottom. Now with that said, let's go ahead and do that to this one right here. This one, the longer one, goes in this area. Typically, it's a good idea to use a little bit of petroleum jelly, or even if you had to, a tiny bit of motor oil. With our lubricant on there, I'm just going to take this and we'll slide it right into position, pushing it in as far as it can go. Give it a little wiggle to make sure it's completely situated. The way that you want to have this facing is essentially directly facing towards the engine. So if I had this on the engine, it's going to go facing straight towards it and not up or down or any other way that you can think of. Now we'll go ahead and do that other one right here. For this one, we have the long end going in, and then we have this shorter end facing out straight like what I said before. That looks perfect. Let's get it in the car. At this point, the tensioner is ready to be installed, in exception of the fact that we need to clean up our mounting bolts. Let's do that now. Now we can start installing our tensioner assembly. One of the holes for our mounting elbows is going to be directly underneath this area here, and then the other one is located right over here on the side of the water pump. Let's go ahead and take this assembly. Start lining up those elbows. We've got this one lined up. We'll do the other one too. Now, if it feels like they're not lining up with their corresponding holes, typically you can just go ahead and slide them in and out of the tensioner assembly as needed. There we are. Once they're lined up, press it in as far as it can go. You want to make sure it's completely bottomed out against the engine before you start in your mounting bolts. Let's start putting in our mounting bolts. For these, we're going to start all of them in. Once they're all started, we can go ahead and snug them up, and then we'll torque them to manufacturer's specification. Once all of your mounting bolts are snugged up, let's go ahead and torque each of these to 37 foot-pounds. Now it's going to be time to get ready to install our coolant hoses. Looking at the hoses, you're going to find 2 O-rings. We need to go ahead and remove these, clean this up, and then install brand new O-rings on each of the hoses. Just going to get this one right out of here. This one's very old. Oh, it's really stuck in there. For this, obviously, I'm using a pick. There isn't much of an inspection for these because we're replacing them, but you can tell why just by giving it a stretch. It's extremely dry and brittle, and it's not going to make a good seal if you tried to reuse it. Ooh, yeah, that one's really dry. With those out of there, I'm just going to go ahead and try to clean this up. I want to try to pay special attention to inside each of these grooves. That's where those O-rings are going to be. You want to make sure it's clean and free of any debris. You can use a wire brush or even some sandpaper. Okay, at this point I have it sanded down fairly well. I'll just go ahead and clean it up and we can grab our O-rings. That looks pretty decent overall. Now it's time to put on our brand new O-rings. You're going to notice in your kit it came with 4 new ones. We want to install all 4. Just going to take it, put it into the groove, bring it right on over. Get that second one. Now you're going to want to continue on with a little bit of petroleum jelly or even a tiny bit of motor oil, like I told you before. Okay, this looks like it's ready to go in. This is the one for the rearward hole. I'm just going to go ahead and line it up. We'll slide it straight down and in. The next thing you want to do is make sure that the bolt hole is lined up. We'll start the bolt in and snug it up. I feel like it's getting close here. Once it feels as though it bottomed out, just give it a teeny bit more. We just want to essentially make sure it's secure so it can't loosen up on us. Now go ahead and grab onto this, give it a little wiggle. You're going to feel a little bit of movement, but that's what those O-rings are for. They're going to seal up the coolant from coming out of here. Now that we have this one on here, we'll do the exact same thing for this one. Go ahead and replace those O-rings as well. Now we can get this bolt in here as well and snug it up. Let's get our alternator back in here. Essentially, all I want to do is just pretty much put it into position. Now I'm going to grab the second longest bolt. This is the longest bolt that doesn't have the stud coming out of it.
Slide this right through here. We're just going to start this in a little bit. Now we can grab our other 2 bolts. The longer bolt with the stud is the one that goes on the passenger side of the mounting holes here. Go ahead and slide that right down and in. It's very important to start in all of your mounting bolts before you snug any of them up. We've got our shortest bolt. That's going to go towards the driver's side on the rear. Let's bottom these out. Once they're snug, torque each of them to 37 foot-pounds. Now we can go ahead and put on our bracket. Slide it right over this. We're going to line it up with the bolt hole down here. Start in this bolt first. Let's put this nut on there. Snug it up. Make sure that's nice and tight. Make sure that one's tight as well. Let's connect this in. Listen for a click, give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Now we can reconnect this wire as well. Before I reconnect these wires, I always like to sand them down with a little bit of sandpaper. Essentially, I just want to make sure that I'm making a perfect connection. Make sure you do both sides. Let's mount this on the alternator. Put our nut on there. Let's bottom this out and torque it to 111 inch-pounds. Put your protective boot on there. Make sure that's covering it completely. Now it's time to install the serpentine belt. To do this, we're going to take the first loop of it and bring it down and around the crank. That's the main pulley all the way at the bottom. Once it feels as though it's on that, we're going to bring the forward aspect down and around that AC compressor. And then this is just going to make its way up here, so we're going to hold it in this position. Now let's start with the rest of the back of the side of the belt here. Yep. Make sure we're around the crank, inside the grooves. We're going to come up and around this water pump. After we come up and around the water pump, we're going to come up and over the tensioner as well. And then we're going to bring this down and all the way to that power steering pump. That's all the way down at the bottom there. Now at this point, we're going to go ahead and put our tool onto the tensioner, decrease the amount of tension on this so we can slide it over the alternator. Now you can't stop here. You have to double check all of the pulleys. All the pulleys that are supposed to have the grooves on them that you can see, you need to make sure the belt's sitting directly inside of them. If the belt's sitting off kilter to one side or the other, you're going to completely ruin the belt. Check all of the pulleys. Now let's just double check to make sure everything that we mounted is nice and tight. Assuming it looks good, let's continue on by putting on our engine cover. For this, you have your little piton right here. It's going to slide into this mounting hole. Once that's in, let's bring this area down so it fits along the top of the engine. Now we can take the oil fill, get this right on here, tighten it up.
Let's make our way back underneath the driver's side of the vehicle. We'll just make sure that the petcock's closed and tight. Then we can start putting up our splash shield. For this, you want to make sure it goes up and over the ears that are underneath the bumper cover. After that, go ahead and put in all of your push clips.
Okay, now it's time to fill our cooling system. Typically, it's a good idea to use some sort of a funnel if you don't have a specialty tool to be able to fill the cooling system. Now, when you fill this, you need to use the manufacturer specified fluid. You don't want to use green coolant. If you were to look at the overflow tank, you can see that it tells you to use a specific type, Dex Cool. It's kind of like a pink red. If you don't have access to that, you can also use a universal fluid. You just want to make sure that it's 50-50 mixed, so it's not complete concentrate. So all I'm going to do is just take some coolant, we'll pour it right in here. This is the universal coolant, so that's why it's this color. It's not green, it's actually yellow. We'll just go ahead and fill up the cooling system. Once it's full, we can go ahead and start it up and burp out any air in the system. Now the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and start up the vehicle. We're going to let it run for a while. What we need to happen is the cooling fans, they need to be able to turn on. Once those turn on, that's going to tell us that the thermostat's open, and we should have some hot heat blowing out the vents. At that point, there shouldn't be any more air inside the system, and we can go ahead and turn off the car, and then of course we can remove the coolant funnel. Once you're sure it's full and there's no air in the system, let's go ahead and reinstall the radiator cap and make sure it's nice and tight. Once the radiator's full, let's make our way over to the coolant overflow. You want to pay attention to the side along here. Essentially, you want to make sure it's up to the full cold line. That's that bottom line right there, and definitely not too much higher than the full hot line. Just get it anywhere in between. Cap it off when you're done. Okay friends, we got the car back together. What's left to do now? Now typically you're going to want to go ahead and start up the vehicle again and let it run for a little while. We're just wanting to make sure that the coolant's nice and full. You have plenty of heat coming from those vents. After that, go ahead and take it for a road test. Make sure you don't hear any funny noises and you don't have a check engine light. Thanks for watching.